A woman alone cannot cut 8 cords of timber and tend 3 children, Amos Jennings told her. The numbers don't lie. Best case, you run out of fuel by February. Worst case, you freeze before Christmas. He'd been in Dakota 15 years. He knew who would survive and who wouldn't. Margarethe Vogel had $47, 3 children under 7, and a half-finished sod house. No husband, no help, no chance, according to everyone. But when temperatures dropped to 46 below in January 1887, her children slept warm through the night without a fire burning. Her neighbors burned their furniture just to stay alive. She'd built something no American had ever built before, a dying stranger's final gift. It worked. The wind screamed across the Dakota prairie at 40 miles an hour. The temperature had fallen to 46 degrees below zero. At that cold, exposed skin freezes in under 3 minutes. Spit crackles before it hits the ground. Metal burns flesh on contact. Inside a sod house 12 miles from the nearest neighbor, 3 children slept. They slept on a platform of clay bricks, raised 18 inches off the packed earth floor. No fire burned in the stove. The coals had died hours ago. Ice crystals formed on the inside of the single window, creeping across the glass like frost flowers. And yet the children's faces were flushed with warmth. Margarethe Vogel placed her palm against the clay surface beneath their blankets. It radiated heat like a stone that had spent all day in summer sun. 72 degrees, maybe 74. Warm enough to sleep, warm enough to survive. 3 miles east, the Hendricks family was burning their kitchen table. They'd run out of firewood 6 days ago. The chairs went first, then the bed frame, then anything that would catch flame. Thomas Hendricks hadn't slept in 4 days. Someone had to feed the stove every hour, or they'd freeze. 5 miles north, the Sorensen cabin had gone dark. No smoke from the chimney since January 25th. No one could reach them to find out why. Everyone knew why. But in this 16 by 14 foot soddy, heat radiated up through clay bricks that held the warmth of yesterday's cooking fire. No flames burning, no fuel consumed, just stored heat, releasing slowly through the longest night of the deadliest winter in frontier memory. 8 months earlier, Margarethe Vogel had arrived at this claim with $47, 3 children under the age of 7, and no husband. What she built had never been built in America before. She came to Dakota Territory in May of 1886, 2 months after burying her husband in frozen Nebraska ground. Johann Vogel had died the way many frontier men died, not dramatically, not heroically, but from pneumonia that started as a cough and ended in a coffin. He was 34 years old. He left behind a half-finished sod house, 160 acres of prairie grass, a cast-iron cook stove purchased on credit, and a widow with 3 children who didn't speak enough English to argue with the banker. Margarethe was 29. She'd been born in a German colony near Odessa, in what maps called the Russian Empire and her parents called exile. She'd crossed an ocean at 22, married Johann in Nebraska at 23, and followed him to Dakota at 27 because he said the land was free and the future was there for anyone willing to work for it. The land was free. Johann was dead. And now the future was her problem alone. She arrived at the claim in a borrowed wagon with everything she owned: 3 children, 2 trunks of clothing, a milk cow, 6 chickens, basic tools, and $47 in cash. Her children were Heinrich, called Henry, age 6, Anna, age 4, and Wilhelm, called Willie, age 2. Henry was old enough to help. Anna was old enough to try. Willie was old enough to create chaos at the worst possible moments. The sod house Johann had started was a shell. 4 walls of cut prairie sod, each wall 3 feet thick, the structure 16 feet long and 14 feet wide. No roof, no door, no floor except packed earth. The cast iron stove sat in the open air beside it, still owing $12 to the Jennings General Store in Wakefield. Margarethe stood in the doorway that wasn't a doorway and calculated what she needed to survive. She needed to finish the roof before the autumn rains. She needed to hang a door before the autumn winds. She needed to plant a garden, tend the chickens, milk the cow, preserve food for winter, patch the children's clothes, and keep 3 small humans alive while doing all of it. And she needed firewood. The mathematics of frontier survival were brutal and specific. A sod house this size, in a Dakota winter, required 6 to 8 cords of wood to stay warm from October to April. A cord was a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, 8 feet long, roughly a ton of timber. 8 cords meant 8 tons of wood. The nearest trees were cottonwoods along a creek 6 miles west. Cottonwood burned fast and gave less heat than hardwood, which meant she'd need the full 8 cords, maybe more. She had no wagon. She had a handcart Johann had built, which could carry maybe 1/8 of a cord per trip. She did the arithmetic while her children explored the half-built house. 8 cords, 1/8 cord per trip. That meant 64 trips. Each trip was 12 miles round trip, 6 miles out and 6 miles back, pulling the loaded cart half the way. 64 trips times 12 miles. 768 miles of walking. She had 6 months. In those 6 months, she also had to finish the house, tend the children, grow food, and keep everyone alive. Alone. Her first trip to Wakefield took 3 hours each way. She brought the children in the handcart because she couldn't leave them alone and had no one to watch them. They arrived at Jennings General Store dusty and tired, Willie crying because he'd fallen asleep and woken up confused. Amos Jennings was 58 years old and had been in Dakota since 1871. He'd seen more homesteaders come and go than he could count. He'd extended credit to families who froze, starved, gave up, or simply vanished. He knew with the certainty of 15 winters who would make it and who wouldn't. He studied Margarethe Vogel's claim paperwork, looked at her 3 children, and shook his head slowly. Your husband filed this claim? Yes, before he died. And you're planning to prove it up yourself? 5 years. That's the requirement. Continuous residence and improvements. I know the requirement. Jennings leaned against his counter. Mrs. Vogel, I'm going to speak plainly because I'd rather be rude now than bury your children in January. Margarethe said nothing. Willie tugged at her skirt. She picked him up without looking away from Jennings. A woman alone cannot cut 8 cords of timber and tend 3 children and keep a garden and finish a sod house. Jennings said, the numbers do not add up. You'd need to walk 800 miles just for firewood. When would you sleep? I'll manage. No, ma'am, you won't. Best case, you run out of fuel by February. Worst case, you freeze before Christmas. I've seen it happen. I've seen children. He stopped, started again. I've seen it happen. What do you suggest? Sell the claim. I'll give you $50 for it today, more than fair. Take your children to Sioux Falls, find work, find family, find a husband if you can. That's how women survive out here. And if I don't sell, Jennings shrugged. Then I'll extend your credit anyway, because I'm a fool who hopes I'm wrong. But I'm not wrong, Mrs. Vogel. The numbers don't lie. He sold her roofing materials on credit. Nails, tar paper, and planks she couldn't afford. He added it to the stove debt. Your funeral, he said as she left, or your children's. Margarethe walked 12 miles home with 3 children and a loaded handcart. The sun was setting by the time she reached the claim. Henry had fallen asleep in the cart. Anna was singing quietly to herself. Willie needed changing. She looked at the half-built house, the empty prairie stretching in every direction, and the 6 miles of horizon between her and the trees she needed to survive. Jennings was right. The numbers didn't add up. She had no idea how she was going to survive the winter. 3 weeks later, she found the dying man. He was lying by the side of the road between Wakefield and her claim, folded into the ditch like something discarded. At first she thought he was dead. Then she saw his chest rise, shallow and uneven, and heard the wet rattle of his breath. His clothes marked him immediately. A silk cap, dusty and torn. A quilted jacket unlike anything worn in Dakota. A long braid of black hair matted with blood. Chinese. Margarethe had seen Chinese workers before, from a distance, when she'd passed through railroad towns with Johann. She knew the stories people told, that they'd stolen jobs building the transcontinental, that they lived in vice dens and opium houses, that they practiced strange religions and stranger customs. She knew the violence, too. The year before, white miners in Wyoming had murdered 28 Chinese workers and burned their homes. It was in all the papers. People had opinions. The man in the ditch was maybe 60 years old. His face was swollen, one eye closed completely. His ribs were clearly broken. She could see the unnatural angle when he breathed. Someone had beaten him, robbed him, and left him to die. Margarethe looked up and down the empty road. No one in sight. No one would know if she walked on. She thought about what her mother had taught her in that German colony in Russia, where travelers were welcomed because everyone had once been a traveler. She thought about Johann, dying alone while she was with the children, no one to hold his hand at the end. She thought about her own situation, alone, desperate, needing any help she could get, even from a dying stranger who spoke no English. "Henry," she said, "help me lift him." Her 6-year-old son looked at the man with wide eyes. "Mama, is he a demon?" "Peter Hendricks says Chinese are demons." "Peter Hendricks is 7 years old and knows nothing. This is a man. He's hurt. We help people who are hurt. Now help me lift him." They got him into the handcart. He weighed almost nothing, bones and cloth and shallow breath. The children walked the rest of the way while Margarethe pulled. His name was Chen Wei. She learned this over 3 days as he drifted in and out of consciousness in her unfinished sod house. His English was broken, a handful of words assembled over decades in a country that didn't want him. But Margarethe's English wasn't much better, and somehow, in fragments and gestures and patience, they communicated. He'd worked on the railroad in the 1860s. Thousands of Chinese men blasting through mountains, laying track across the Sierra Nevada, dying in avalanches and explosions and cave-ins so that white men could ride trains to California. After the railroad, he'd gone to the gold mines in Deadwood, washing gravel for color until his back gave out. He'd been traveling east when men had stopped him on the road. They took his money, his pack, everything except his clothes. Then they beat him for being Chinese. He was dying. They both knew it. Internal bleeding, probably. Broken ribs pressing on things that shouldn't be pressed. He had days, maybe. On the second night, when the children were asleep and the oil lamp flickered low, Chen Wei told her about the Kang. "In my home," he said, each word carefully chosen. "North, very cold. Cold like here." "Yes, cold." "We sleep." He gestured, searching for words. "We sleep on brick bed." Margarethe didn't understand. "Brick?" Chen Wei pointed at the cast iron stove, then mimed smoke rising. He pointed at an imaginary structure, traced channels in the air with his fingers, showed smoke flowing through them. Then he placed his palms flat, miming warmth rising, and pretended to sleep. "Fire here," he said, pointing at the stove. "Smoke go." His fingers traced the path again. "Inside brick. Brick get warm. You sleep. Warm all night. No more fire. Still warm. The bricks hold the heat? Yes, hold. Like, he searched for the word. Like stone in sun. Margarethe sat very still. In Russia, her father had built a pech, a masonry stove that took up a quarter of their small house. The pech had a sleeping platform on top where the children slept, warmed by the heated brick. She knew that thermal mass held heat. She'd grown up with it. But this was different. Chen Wei wasn't describing heat from above. He was describing heat from below. A bed that warmed itself. Smoke that would otherwise escape up the chimney captured and forced through channels, giving up its heat before it left. How much wood? She asked. How much for winter? Chen Wei thought. Half, he said finally. Maybe half. Half? Instead of 8 cords, she might survive on 4. Instead of 768 miles of walking, 384. Instead of impossible, maybe possible. Can you tell me more? She asked. How to build it. Chen Wei spent his remaining strength explaining. The platform should be built of brick or mud brick, raised off the floor. Inside channels like a snake, back and forth, so the smoke traveled far before escaping. A slight slope upward, so the hot air would rise and the draft would pull. One end connected to the stove, the other to a chimney. The bricks would absorb heat from the smoke. The surface would stay warm for hours after the fire died. He drew diagrams in the dirt floor with a trembling finger. He described dimensions in terms she didn't fully understand, using Chinese measurements she couldn't convert. But the principle was clear. Capture the heat that would otherwise escape. Store it. Sleep on it. Chen Wei died on the 4th day. Margarethe buried him on her claim, on a small rise where the prairie grass grew thick. The children helped her gather stones for a cairn. Henry asked if the man was in heaven now. Margarethe said she hoped so. She stood at the grave as the sun set, thinking about what she'd been given, a chance, a design, a principle that might work or might fail spectacularly. If she spent weeks building this thing and it didn't work, she'd have even less time to gather wood. She'd be worse off than if she'd never tried. But if she didn't try, if she stuck to the conventional path, she knew exactly where that led. Jennings had told her. The numbers didn't lie. The conventional path led to a February funeral. She made her decision that night. The next morning, she started making bricks. News traveled slowly on the prairie, but it traveled. By July, the settlement around Wakefield knew that the Vogel widow was up to something strange. Clara Hendricks found out first. She lived 3 miles east with her husband Thomas and their 4 children, and she considered herself responsible for checking on her neighbors, especially neighbors who were clearly going to get themselves killed. She rode over on a Tuesday morning and found Margarethe knee-deep in mud. The widow had dug a pit near the creek that crossed her property and filled it with clay, sand, and water. She was mixing the slurry with her bare feet, stomping and turning, while her children threw handfuls of dried grass into the mess. Beside the pit, rows of wooden forms held drying bricks, rectangular blocks the color of old blood, baking in the July sun. "What in the Lord's name are you doing?" Margarethe looked up, wiped sweat from her forehead with a muddy hand, and smiled. "Making bricks." "I can see that. Why? Your house has walls already." "Not for walls, for inside." Clara dismounted and walked closer, studying the operation. The bricks were uniform, roughly 10 inches by 14 by 4. There had to be 200 of them already, maybe more. "Mrs. Vogel, Margarethe, it's July. You should be cutting wood. You should be putting up hay. You should not be standing in a mud pit making bricks for something you won't explain." "I'm building a heated bed." "A what?" Margarethe explained as best she could, The platform, the channels, the smoke flowing through, giving up its heat, the surface staying warm all night without a fire burning. Clara listened with her arms crossed. When Margarethe finished, Clara shook her head. I've never heard of such a thing. It's used in China, where winters are cold like ours. China? Clara's tone made the word sound like a disease. And how did you, a German widow in Dakota territory, learn about Chinese heating methods? Margarethe hesitated. She hadn't told anyone about Chen Wei. She knew what people would say. I read about it, she lied. In a book. What book? A book about building, from the library in Omaha. Clara studied her for a long moment, clearly not believing a word of it, but she let it go. Even if it works, and I don't see how it could, because if such a thing worked, someone would have done it by now. You're wasting weeks of good weather on an experiment. You should be gathering fuel, not mixing mud. I've done the mathematics, Margarethe said. I can't gather enough fuel the traditional way. I need something different. The mathematics, Clara sighed. Look, I like you. I don't want to see you and your children freeze, but this... She gestured at the mud pit, the drying bricks, the whole peculiar operation. This feels like desperation dressed up as cleverness. Desperation is accurate, Margarethe said. I am desperate, but that doesn't make me wrong. And if it doesn't work? If you spend all summer on this thing and it fills your house with smoke or cracks from the heat or just plain doesn't warm anything, then I'll freeze, like Jennings said I would anyway. Clara had no answer for that. She mounted her horse and looked down at the widow standing in her mud pit, children dirty and tired, 300 bricks drying in the sun. I hope you're right, Clara said. I truly do. But when you get sick from standing in cold mud, or when that contraption of yours fails, I'll bring soup. She rode away without looking back. The Reverend Harold Whitmore arrived in Wakefield on the 3rd Sunday of August, same as he did every month. He rode a circuit of 6 communities, 50 miles of prairie, saving souls and passing judgment. Whitmore was 45 years old, originally from Ohio, and had strong opinions about nearly everything. He believed women should marry. He believed immigrants should abandon their foreign customs. He believed the frontier needed order, structure, and obedience to proper authority. He had opinions about Margarethe Vogel. She encountered him after the service outside the general store where she'd come to buy lime for mortar. She was trying to avoid attention, but Whitmore had a way of finding people who didn't want to be found. Mrs. Vogel. He planted himself in her path, tall and thin in his black coat. I understand you're building something unusual on your claim. A heated bed, Reverend, for the winter. A heated bed. He spoke the words as if they were contaminated. I've heard descriptions. Smoke flowing through brick channels. A sleeping platform warmed by captured heat. He paused. A Chinese design, I'm told. A Chinaman's stove. Margarethe felt cold despite the August sun. It's a practical solution to a practical problem. Is it? Or is it foreign superstition brought to our Christian community by someone who should know better? Whitmore stepped closer. I knew your husband. Johann was a godly man. He would be grieved to see his widow building heathen contraptions and burying Chinamen on consecrated ground. So he knew about Chen Wei. Of course he did. Nothing stayed secret on the prairie. Chen Wei was a man who needed help, Margarethe said carefully. I gave him shelter. He died. I buried him, as any Christian would. Any Christian would have sent for a proper authority. Any Christian would have let the Chinese bury their own, in their own heathen ways. Instead, you brought a pagan into your home, with your children present, and learned his pagan practices. I learned how to keep my children alive through winter. Whitmore's eyes narrowed. A widow's place is with family, Mrs. Vogel. Not alone on the prairie with outlandish ideas and foreign customs. Your children need a father. They need a proper home. Not a mother who thinks she knows better than every man in the territory. My children have a mother who will do whatever is necessary to keep them alive. Pride. Whitmore spoke the word like a verdict. Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. He leaned in, his breath sour. When you fail, and you will fail, don't come begging to the church for charity. And don't be surprised if godly folk ask questions about whether a woman with such unusual ideas is fit to raise children at all. There it was, the threat she'd been dreading. In frontier communities, children could be taken from parents deemed unfit. It was rare, but it happened. Widows who couldn't provide, mothers who made strange choices. All it took was enough whispers, enough concern, enough good Christians who thought they knew better. Margarethe looked at Whitmore for a long moment. She thought about arguing. She thought about defending herself, explaining the engineering, the mathematics, the desperate logic that had led her here. Instead, she said, "Thank you for your concern, Reverend." And she walked away, her hands trembling on the handle of her cart. The next weeks were the hardest of her life. She worked from dawn until she couldn't see, then worked by lantern light until she couldn't stand. The children helped when they could, and slept in exhausted piles when they couldn't. Her hands blistered, healed, and blistered again. She lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, and everywhere she went, she felt eyes on her. In Wakefield, conversation stopped when she entered the store. Women who might have offered to help with the children kept their distance. Men looked at her with expressions that mixed pity and judgment in equal measure. She heard fragments. The Vogel widow. That Chinese thing she's building. Those poor children. Pride goeth before the fall. Once Henry came home from playing with the Hendricks children and asked why Peter said their mother was a witch. Margarethe knelt down, took her son's dirty face in her hands, and said, "Do I look like a witch to you?" "No, Mama." "Then Peter's wrong. Sometimes people say things about what they don't understand. It doesn't make them right. It just makes them scared." "Are you scared, Mama?" She almost lied. She'd been lying to her children for months, telling them everything would be fine, pretending confidence she didn't feel. "Yes," she said. "I'm scared, but I'm going to keep working anyway. That's what we do when we're scared. We keep working." Henry nodded, serious as only a 6-year-old can be. "I'll keep working too." "I know you will. You're a good boy." She sent him to feed the chickens and stood alone in the half-light, watching summer fade and winter approach. September brought frost. Margarethe woke on the 5th morning of the month to find ice on the water bucket and her breath fogging in the pre-dawn air. The children burrowed deeper into their blankets, reluctant to leave warmth for the cold room. She had 320 adobe bricks. She had the platform foundation laid, flat stones dug 4 inches into the packed earth floor, leveled and stable. She had clay and lime and sand for mortar. She had a design that existed mostly in her head, reconstructed from a dying man's gestures and diagrams drawn in dirt. She did not have time. The channel construction began that week. This was the critical work, the part that would determine whether the Kang functioned or failed. Inside the platform, she built walls of adobe brick to create smoke passages. Each channel was 6 inches wide and 6 inches tall, running the full length of the platform and then doubling back again, snaking through the interior like a river through a canyon. 24 feet of channel, total, inside an 8 by 6 foot platform. The mortar work was the hardest part. Every joint had to seal perfectly. A single gap meant smoke in the house. Smoke in the house meant suffocation, or at minimum, waking every hour to coughing children. She mixed the mortar in small batches, clay, lime, and sand, and applied it with her bare hands, pressing it into joints, smoothing it flat, then coming back hours later to check for cracks and fill them again. Her fingers cracked and bled. The lime burned. She wrapped rags around her hands and kept working. Henry carried bricks. Anna carried water. Willie created chaos, as always, and Margarethe worked with him tied to her back when she couldn't spare attention to watch him. September 12th. Channel walls half complete, 90 bricks laid, mortar cracking in places, too dry, too fast. She tore out a section and started again. September 19th. Channel walls complete. She built a small fire outside the platform and tested the draft, letting smoke flow through the channels to see if it moved properly. It moved. Slowly. Unevenly. But it moved. The smoke entered at one end and emerged at the other, and when she put her hand on the brick walls after an hour, they were warm. She let herself hope. September 26th. Top surface begins. This was the sleeping platform itself, flat bricks laid across the channel walls, mortared tight, then covered in a layer of clay plaster smoothed while wet. The surface had to be perfect. A slight slope from one end to the other, 3% grade, so the smoke would rise naturally and the draft would pull. Too flat, and the smoke would stall. Too steep, and the heat wouldn't transfer properly. She worked by feel, by instinct, by memory of what Chen Wei had tried to explain in broken English and trembling gestures. October 3rd. Top surface complete. The platform sat against the interior wall of the sod house, 8 feet long, 6 feet wide, 18 inches high. It looked like a giant clay altar, brick red and solid. Beautiful or hideous, she couldn't tell anymore. She was too tired. October 10th. First real test. She fired the cook stove at dawn, cooked breakfast, then closed the damper partially to route smoke through the Kang instead of straight up the chimney. The children watched, wide-eyed, as smoke flowed into the platform. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then smoke began seeping through a dozen cracks in the surface. "Mama," Anna said, coughing. "Mama, it's smoky." Margarethe yanked open the damper, let the smoke go up the chimney the normal way. The room cleared slowly, her children red-eyed and coughing. She'd sealed the joints twice. It wasn't enough. That night, after the children slept, she went through the entire surface inch by inch with a candle, looking for gaps by the way the flame flickered. She found 11 leaks. She mixed more mortar, filled them, and waited for morning. October 12th. Second test. Smoke flowed into the Kang. No leaks from the surface. She felt a surge of relief. Then smoke began backing up into the room from the stove connection. The draft wasn't pulling. The channels weren't drawing the smoke through. The children coughed. Willie cried. Margarethe pulled everyone outside into the October cold and stood watching smoke pour from her door like the house was on fire. Inside, she could see the problem now that she was looking for it. The chimney wasn't tall enough. The slope wasn't steep enough. The whole system didn't have enough pull to move the smoke through 24 feet of channels. Chen Wei had said 3% grade. Friedrich Huber, the German-Russian man who'd built masonry stoves in the old country, had said his father's petch used steeper. 3% wasn't enough. She would have to tear out the channels and rebuild them. 2 weeks of work, gone. She sat on the cold ground outside her smoke-filled sod house while her children huddled around her for warmth. Anna asked when they could go back inside. Henry asked if the bed was broken. Willie cried because Willie always cried. For the first time since Johann died, Margarethe let herself weep. The next morning, Friedrich Huber arrived with a wagon load of clay and lime. He was 52 years old, gray-bearded, taciturn. He'd come to Dakota from a German colony near Saratov, where his family had lived for 4 generations. He'd built a petch with his father as a young man. He understood thermal mass the way Margarethe understood bread making, not from books, but from hands and memory. "My wife sent supplies," he said, which was a lie. His wife disapproved of the Vogel widow and her strange projects. He'd come on his own, without telling anyone. "I don't have money to pay you." "In spring, a day's labor on my roof. Fair trade." It wasn't fair trade. They both knew it. But Huber had seen the smoke pouring from her door, and he'd recognized what she was trying to build. "The grade is wrong," he said, walking around the platform. 3%, yes? My father used 4, maybe 5 for difficult draws." He examined the chimney. "And this is too short. The taller the chimney, the stronger the pull. 6 feet minimum, better 8. "I don't have time to rebuild everything." "No, but you can modify. Tear out the channels, yes, that you must do. But rebuild with steeper grade. Add height to the chimney. I have bricks in the wagon you can use. 2 weeks, maybe less." "I've already lost 2 weeks." Huber shrugged. "Then you lose 2 more. Or you give up and freeze with everyone else." He looked at her, not unkindly. "I don't tell my wife I helped you. I don't tell the Reverend. But I know what this is, and I know it can work. My father heated our house through Russian winters with something like this. Not exactly. The petch is different, but the principle is the same." Margarethe looked at the platform, the wasted work, the weeks of labor that had produced nothing but smoke and failure. She looked at her children, who needed her to succeed. She looked at the winter coming, cold and absolute. "Show me," she said. "Show me everything you know." The rebuild took 11 days. Huber came twice more, bringing advice and pretending to borrow tools. He showed her how to calculate draft, how to angle the channels, how to build a chimney that would pull properly in the wind. She tore out the channel walls and rebuilt them with a 5% grade. She raised the chimney from 4 feet to 6 using Huber's bricks. She remortared every joint, then sealed them again with a clay slip that would harden in the fire's heat. October 26th, 3rd test. She fired the stove, closed the damper, and watched. Smoke flowed into the Kang. Smoke moved through the channels. Smoke rose up the chimney and disappeared into the gray October sky. No leaks, no backflow, just heat moving through brick, warming everything it touched. She put her hand on the platform surface. It was warm, not hot. The system took time to heat, but warm, like sun-warmed stone, like safety. She waited an hour, checked again. Warmer, waited 3 hours, still warm. The fire had died to coals, but the bricks held the heat. November 1st, first night on the Kang. The children piled onto the platform with every blanket they owned. Margarethe fired the stove at supper time, cooked their meal, fed the fire until the bricks were hot to the touch, then let it die to embers. They slept. At midnight she woke and checked the surface. 78 degrees. At dawn she checked again. 68 degrees, still warm. The room was cold. The stove had been dead for 10 hours, but the platform had held its heat all night. Willie didn't want to get off the bed to eat breakfast. It worked. November 3rd. Margarethe counted her firewood. 3 3/4 cords stacked behind the sod house. She'd gathered some through the summer between brick-making sessions, but nowhere near enough for a conventional winter. If the Kang performed as Chen Wei had promised, half the fuel consumption, she'd need 3 to 4 cords to survive until spring. She had just enough. Maybe. If the winter was mild, if nothing went wrong, If the Kang kept working the way it had for 2 nights, that was a lot of ifs. But she'd done what she could, built what she could, prepared as well as anyone in her position could prepare. Now she could only wait. The ice storm came on November 16th. Margarethe woke to a world coated in glass. Every blade of grass, every fence post, every branch of every distant tree encased in ice that glittered in the weak morning sun. It was beautiful. It was deadly. The ice storm was the beginning, the first warning of what was coming. Old-timers would later call the winter of 1886 to 1887 the Great Die-Up, the winter that ended the open range, the winter that froze cattle standing in fields and buried homesteads under 15-foot drifts. But on November 16th, Margarethe didn't know any of that. She only knew that the temperature had dropped 20 degrees overnight, that the ice made it impossible to gather more wood, and that somewhere in the dark months ahead, the real test was waiting. The Kang worked in November, but November wasn't winter. November wasn't even close. December came in waves. The first blizzard hit on December 4th and didn't let up for 5 days. Temperatures dropped to 28 degrees below zero. Visibility fell to nothing. Margarethe couldn't see the woodpile from her door, couldn't see anything but white chaos screaming across the prairie. She fired the stove 3 times a day, breakfast, midday, supper. Each firing heated the Kang platform. Each firing consumed a careful measure of wood. Between firings, the family stayed on the platform, wrapped in blankets, playing quiet games, telling stories, waiting for the wind to stop. It didn't stop. On the 6th day, the sky cleared. Margarethe dug out her door. The snow had drifted 4 feet up the south wall and counted her remaining fuel, 2 3/4 cords. In 6 days of blizzard, she'd burned 3/4 of a cord. The same period last winter when Johann was alive and they heated the conventional way had consumed a cord and a half the fuel. Just as Chen Wei had promised. She allowed herself a small private smile. Then she started hauling the snow away from her woodpile before it could freeze solid. Clara Hendricks appeared 2 days later, bundled in every piece of clothing she owned, her face red from the cold. "You're alive." "Yes." "Thomas sent me to check. He said—" Clara stopped, reconsidered her words. "He said we should make sure you hadn't frozen. As you can see." Clara looked past her into the sod house. The Kang platform dominated the back wall, clay-red and solid. No fire burned in the stove, but Anna and Willie were playing on the platform in their underclothes, comfortable as summer. "It's warm in here." "Yes." "The stove isn't lit." "No, I fired it this morning. The bricks hold the heat." Clara stared at the platform for a long moment. Margarethe could see her working through it, the implications, the fuel savings, the survival mathematics she'd dismissed as fantasy back in July. "It's early December," Clara finally said. "The real cold hasn't come yet." "I know. When it hits 40 below, 50 below, we'll see if your Chinese bed keeps working." "We will." Clara left without saying goodbye, but she looked back 3 times before she disappeared over the rise. In Wakefield, Amos Jennings added the Vogel claim to his list of families to check after the next bad storm. He expected to find her dead. He'd been in Dakota long enough to know that hope and cleverness were no match for 40 below zero. Reverend Whitmore passed through on his circuit and didn't ask about her directly, but he told the congregation that the winter would separate the faithful from the prideful, and everyone knew who he meant. The temperature dropped to 31 below on December 14th, rose to 12 above on the 20th, dropped again to 26 below on Christmas Day. Margarethe tracked her fuel consumption in a small notebook she'd kept since October. Each firing measured carefully, each day accounted for. By New Year's Day, she had used 1.5 cords total since November 1st. She had 2.25 cords remaining. She needed approximately 2 cords to reach April. The margin was razor thin. But it existed. The first week of January 1887 was almost mild. Temperatures hovered in the teens. Light snow fell, but no major storms. The sun appeared for hours at a time, weak but present. Old-timers said the worst was over. Ranchers relaxed. Settlers let down their guard. They were wrong. On January 8th, the barometric pressure began to drop. The sky turned the color of old iron. The air went still in a way that felt like held breath. Margarethe recognized the signs. She'd seen them in Russia as a child before the worst storms, when her father would bring the animals inside and her mother would cook everything in the house so they'd have food if they couldn't reach the stove for days. She spent January 8th hauling extra wood inside, stacking it against the wall near the stove. She filled every container with water. She cooked a massive pot of stew that would last a week if stretched. Henry watched her work. "Is a storm coming, Mama?" "Yes." "A bad one." She looked at her son, 6 years old, too young to lie to, too young for the whole truth. "We'll be fine," she said. "We have the bed." At dawn on January 9th, the wind began to scream. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours. At noon on January 9th, it was 8 degrees below zero. By supper time, it was 38 below. The wind drove snow horizontally across the prairie, visibility falling to zero before dark. Margarethe fired the stove hot, hotter than usual, pushing as much heat into the Kang platform as she could. The children sat on the warm bricks and watched her feed log after log into the flames. "Mama, why so much fire?" "Because tonight will be very cold." By midnight, the temperature had fallen to 42 below zero. The sod walls groaned in the wind. Ice formed on the inside of the window, not just frost, but solid ice, an inch thick. The water bucket near the door froze solid despite being inside. But on the Kang platform, the surface temperature held at 82 degrees. The children slept. The blizzard didn't stop. January 10th, 11th, 12th. The wind never dropped below 30 miles an hour. The snow kept falling, burying everything, erasing the world outside the sod house until there was nothing but white and gray and the howling dark. On January 12th, Willie started coughing. By evening, he had a fever. His forehead burned under Margarethe's hand. He wouldn't eat. He cried constantly, not his usual crying, not the fussing of a tired 2-year-old, but the thin, keening cry of a child in pain. Margarethe knew what this meant. She couldn't leave to get help. Travel was impossible. The drifts were 8 feet high, the visibility 0, the temperature 40 degrees below. Anyone who stepped outside would be lost within minutes. She couldn't let the house get cold. A sick child in cold temperatures would develop pneumonia. Pneumonia at 40 below, 12 miles from a doctor, meant death. She couldn't use extra fuel to heat the room beyond what the Kang provided. She didn't have enough wood to waste, and burning through her supply would mean freezing later, even if Willie recovered. She had to keep him warm, fed, hydrated, and alive using only what she had. The Kang became Willie's sickbed. She laid him in the center of the platform, the warmest spot, where the channels converged beneath the surface. She piled blankets around him. She heated water on the stove and dripped it into his mouth with a spoon. She stayed awake through the night, watching his chest rise and fall, counting the seconds between breaths. Henry and Anna helped. Henry fetched water from the bucket, breaking through the ice that formed on top. Anna sang songs to Willie, the German lullabies their grandmother had sung, trying to soothe him. January 13th, the fever climbed. Willie's skin went red. then pale. He stopped crying, too weak to cry. Margarethe prayed. She hadn't prayed since Johann died, hadn't seen the point, but now she prayed with everything she had. She bargained with God. She made promises she knew she couldn't keep. She begged. January 14th. The fever held. Neither better nor worse. Willie slept fitfully, whimpering in dreams. January 15th. Dawn. Margarethe woke with her hand on Willie's forehead. Cool. Not cold, cool. Normal. The fever had broken. Willie opened his eyes. Mama. Hungry. She wept. She held him and wept and didn't care that Henry and Anna were watching, didn't care about anything except the miracle of her son asking for food. The Kang had kept him warm through 4 nights of fever. The constant, gentle heat, not the blast and fade of a stove fire, but the steady warmth of thermal mass, had supported his body while he fought. She didn't know if the Kang had saved his life. She would never know for certain, but she believed it had. The blizzard continued. January 16th through the 27th was a series of storms separated by brief, brutal breaks. The temperature never rose above 15 degrees below zero. Most days it hovered around 30 below. The wind never stopped. Margarethe fell into a rhythm. Fire the stove at dawn. Cook breakfast. Fire again at midday if the cold was severe. Fire at supper. Let the Kang hold through the night. Her fuel supply dropped. 2 cords. 1 3/4. 1 1/2. She started rationing. Smaller fires. Colder mornings. She wore all her clothes to bed, layering wool over wool, and still woke shivering. But the children stayed warm. That was what mattered. January 28th. The worst week began. The temperature fell to 46 degrees below zero and stayed there. Wind chill pushed it lower. How much lower? No one could measure. At these temperatures, the air itself became dangerous. Breathing hurt. Exposed skin froze in under 3 minutes. Metal stuck to flesh and tore it when pulled away. Margarethe didn't leave the sod house for 6 days. She couldn't. The drift against her door reached 5 feet. Even if she dug out, there was nowhere to go and no way to survive the journey. Inside, she kept the stove burning longer than usual, pushing more heat into the Kang, trying to build a reserve against the unthinkable cold. The platform's surface climbed to 90 degrees, uncomfortably warm, almost hot to touch. She needed that heat. At night, with no fire burning, the room temperature dropped below freezing within hours. Ice formed on every surface. Their breath fogged and froze on the blankets. But on the Kang, the temperature fell slowly, 90 to 80 to 70 to 65. Warm enough. Survivable. The children learned to stay on the platform. They played games there, ate there, slept there. The floor became foreign territory, a frozen wasteland a few feet below their warm island. January 29th. Someone pounded on the door. Margarethe couldn't imagine who would be outside in this cold, couldn't imagine how anyone had survived the walk to her claim. She dug through the drift blocking the door, fingers numb despite her mittens, and found Clara Hendricks collapsed against the frame. Clara's face was white, not red from cold, white. Frostbite white. Her lips were blue. She was shaking so hard she couldn't speak. Margarethe dragged her inside, hauled her to the Kang, stripped off her frozen outer clothes. Clara's fingers were waxy and stiff. Her ears had no color at all. "Warm," Clara whispered. "Warm. How is it warm?" "Don't talk. Lie still." Margarethe heated water, made Clara drink, wrapped her in blankets on the platform. Slowly, agonizingly, color began to return. It took 2 hours before Clara could speak clearly. "Thomas is sick. Fever, like influenza, maybe. He can't tend the fire. I've been doing it alone for 3 days, but we ran out of wood yesterday. We burned the chairs. We burned the small bed. There's nothing left. Her voice broke. The children are cold. So cold. I didn't know what to do. I walked. I don't know how far. 3 miles. I fell twice. I thought I would die, but I couldn't let the children. She couldn't finish. Margarethe looked at the Kang, at her children huddled together, watching with wide eyes, at Clara, shaking on the platform that had saved Margarethe's own family. She looked at her woodpile. 1 1/4 cords, maybe 6 weeks of fuel if she was careful. If she gave wood to Clara, she might not have enough to last the winter. If she didn't give wood to Clara, the Hendricks children might die. There was never really a choice. She loaded the handcart with half a cord of wood, half of what she had left. She wrapped herself in every piece of clothing she owned, layers upon layers, until she could barely move. She told Henry to keep the stove fire going, keep his siblings on the Kang, don't open the door for anyone until she returned. Where are you going, Mama? To help Mrs. Hendricks. But it's cold outside. Yes. Will you come back? She knelt down and looked her son in the eyes. Yes, I will come back. Keep your brother and sister warm. I'm trusting you. Henry nodded, solemn. 6 years old, suddenly ancient. She stepped outside. The cold was beyond anything she had ever experienced. It hit her like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs, freezing her nostrils shut with her first breath. She couldn't see. The wind drove snow into her eyes, and within seconds her lashes had frozen together. She pulled the handcart by feel, following the faint path she'd broken, digging out the door. The drift was waist-high. The cart stuck every few feet. She pulled, heaved, dragged, and moved forward inches at a time. She couldn't feel her feet after the first quarter mile. She couldn't feel her hands after half a mile. She kept walking. The world disappeared into white. There was no horizon, no landmarks, no sun. Just snow and wind and cold so profound it seemed to have weight pressing down on her, slowing her, trying to make her stop and rest. She knew what stopping meant. She kept walking. The Hendricks cabin appeared out of the white like a ghost. She almost walked past it. The drifts had buried it nearly to the roof, turning it into just another hump of snow on the endless prairie. But she saw the corner of the door, the edge of a window, and angled toward it. Inside, she found what Clara had described. Thomas Hendricks lay on the bed, delirious with fever, muttering words that made no sense. His 4 children were piled around him, using his body heat, their faces pinched with cold and hunger. The stove was dead. The room temperature was maybe 20 degrees, maybe less. They had burned everything, the chairs, the table, one of the beds, the shelves from the wall. In a few more hours, they would have started on the door frame, the window frame, the bed Thomas lay on. Margarethe got a fire going. It took 3 tries. Her fingers were too numb to work properly, the kindling too cold to catch. But eventually flames appeared and then grew, and then heat began to fill the room. She stacked the wood she'd brought against the wall, half a cord, maybe 5 days of fuel if they were careful. More, she said to the oldest Hendricks boy, who was maybe 10. You'll need more. When the storm breaks, go to Huber's place. He'll help. Tell him Margarethe sent you. The boy nodded, too cold and scared to question. She looked around the cabin, at the sick man on the bed, at the children already moving toward the stove, toward the warmth they'd been denied for days, at everything the Hendricks had burned trying to survive. There was nothing more she could do. She stepped back into the storm. The walk home took 2 hours. It should have taken 1, but she got turned around twice, lost in the white, stumbling through drifts that reached her chest. At one point she fell and couldn't get up, couldn't make her legs work, couldn't do anything but lie in the snow and feel the cold seeping in. She thought about Johann, about how easy it would be to just stay here, to let the cold take her, to stop fighting. She thought about her children. She got up. She kept walking. Henry had the fire burning when she pushed through the door. He'd done exactly what she told him. Stove hot, Kang warming, Willie and Anna bundled on the platform. Margarethe couldn't speak. Her jaw was frozen shut, her lips too numb to form words. She pulled off her outer clothes, stiff with ice, frozen solid, and crawled onto the Kang. The warmth hit her like a drug. She pressed her body against the heated clay, feeling sensation return to her feet in agonizing waves of pain. Frostbite. Definitely frostbite. How bad? She couldn't tell yet. Anna curled against her. Willie, recovered from his fever, pressed his warm little body to her side. Henry sat at the end of the platform, watching her, waiting to be told what to do next. "Good boy," she whispered. "You did so good." She slept for 14 hours. She woke to silence. The wind had stopped. February 4th. The blizzard was over. She climbed off the Kang slowly, painfully, her feet swollen and discolored but functional, and opened the door. The world was white and still. Snow covered everything, drifts reaching to the roofline in places. The prairie transformed into an ocean of frozen waves. The sun hung low and pale, but it was there, visible for the first time in weeks. She looked toward the Hendricks place. A thin line of smoke rose against the blue sky. They'd made it. She looked toward the Sorensen place, 5 miles north. No smoke, no sign of life at all. She looked at her woodpile, half buried in snow. 3/4 of a cord remained. 6 weeks until spring. It was going to be enough. The thaw began in late February, and with it came the counting of the dead. Eric Sorensen had walked out to his haystack on January 25th and never made it back. They found his body 6 feet from his front door. He'd gotten turned around in the whiteout, walked in circles, and frozen standing up. His wife Ingrid and their 2 children had survived by burning everything flammable in the house, including most of Eric's clothes. The Haversham claim, 8 miles south of Wakefield, went silent in late January. A bachelor homesteader, 42 years old, found dead in his cabin in mid-February. He'd had plenty of wood stacked outside, but he'd gotten sick, couldn't tend the fire, and the cold had killed him while he lay in bed. The Muller family, the Janssens, old Thomas Reedy, who'd been in Dakota since before the railroad. The counting went on for weeks. In Amos Jennings' territory alone, 11 families had lost at least 1 member. 4 families had been wiped out entirely. Jennings kept a list. He had to, for the records, for the claims, for the letters he'd write to distant relatives who would never understand what had happened here. He also kept a different list, families who'd made it through. The Vogel widow was on that list. She came to Wakefield in early March, when the roads were passable again. She brought eggs. Her chickens had survived, kept warm in a corner of the sod house, their body heat supplemented by the Kang's radiance. Other settlers' chickens had frozen solid. Jennings watched her count out coins, payment for supplies she'd purchased on credit last summer. "You made it." "Yes. I heard you gave wood to the Hendricks. Half your supply," Clara said. She told everyone. Margarethe said nothing. She wasn't interested in being praised for something any decent person would have done. "That woman walked 3 miles in 40 below temperatures because she knew you'd help her," Jennings continued. "She knew, and she barely knows you. Why is that?" "She was desperate." "Lots of people were desperate. She came to you." Jennings leaned on his counter. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, softer, tired. I told you last spring that the numbers didn't add up. I told you to sell and leave. I told you that a widow alone couldn't survive a Dakota winter. I remember. I was wrong. He looked at her directly, something he had avoided before. The numbers I was using weren't the numbers you were using. I didn't know that was possible. I've been in Dakota 15 years, and I didn't know. He reached under the counter and pulled out a piece of paper, a rough sketch. Thomas Hendricks drew this. He said it's your heating bed, the channels, the bricks, how it connects to the stove. He slid it across the counter. He wants to build one before next winter. He's not the only one asking. Margarethe looked at the drawing. It was crude but accurate, the basic principle captured, the layout clear enough to work from. Can I keep this? It's yours, or his, or whoever's. I don't care about ownership, Mrs. Vogel. I care about people surviving. He paused. If this thing works like Clara says it does, everyone should have one. They came to her claim starting in April. Clara Hendricks brought 2 other women, Ingrid Sorensen, newly widowed, and Margaret Calhoun, who'd arrived that spring from Illinois and knew nothing about Dakota winters. They wanted to see. They wanted to understand. They wanted to learn. Margarethe showed them everything. She showed them the platform, now cool in the spring warmth but still intact. She showed them the channel layout, explaining how the smoke traveled through the serpentine path before exiting up the chimney. She showed them the mortar work, the slope, the way the stovepipe connected. She answered every question. She drew diagrams in the dirt floor, the same way Chen Wei had drawn them for her. She held nothing back. "Why are you telling us all this?" Margaret Calhoun asked. "You could charge money. You could make people pay to learn." Margarethe thought about Chen Wei, a dying man, beaten and robbed, who'd given her the knowledge that saved her children's lives, a gift from a stranger she couldn't repay because he died before she could try. "Someone gave this to me," she said. "I didn't earn it. I received it. If I keep it to myself, I steal what was given freely." Clara and Thomas Hendricks began construction in May. Thomas was a better carpenter than Johann had been. He improved the chimney design, added a damper system that allowed better control of airflow, built the platform with a removable inspection panel so the channels could be cleaned. The Hendricks Kang worked on the first test. No smoke backflow, no leaks. Perfect draft. "You were right," Clara told Margarethe, standing in the finished cabin, hand pressed against the warming bricks. "I said if it worked, someone would have done it. I was wrong. Sometimes things work and no one does them anyway. Because they don't know. Because they're scared. Because they can't imagine anything different." She looked at Margarethe with something new in her expression. Respect, maybe. Or wonder. "How did you imagine it? When everyone told you it was impossible?" "I didn't imagine it," Margarethe said. "Someone showed me. Someone who'd seen it work in a place none of us will ever go. The Chinaman. His name was Chen Wei. He died so I could live. The least I can do is share what he taught me." By the following winter, 3 families in the Wakefield area had Kang-style heated beds. By the winter after that, 12. Word spread to neighboring settlements. A homesteader from Rapid City rode 40 miles to see the design. A man from Nebraska wrote a letter asking for detailed plans. The fuel savings proved consistent. 40 to 60% reduction in firewood consumption. Families that would have burned 8 cords got through the winter on 4. Families that would have run out by February still had wood in April. Not everyone adopted the design. Some didn't believe it would work. Some couldn't afford the construction time. Some simply preferred the familiar misery of conventional heating to the uncertain promise of something new. But the ones who built it survived. Reverend Whitmore never acknowledged he'd been wrong. He continued his circuit through the territory, preaching and judging, and if anyone asked about the Vogel widow and her heated bed, He changed the subject. He never mentioned the winter when he'd called her prideful and heathen. He never admitted that her Chinese contraption had saved lives. Some skeptics converted, some simply fell silent. Both were victories. Margarethe Vogel proved up her claim in 1889. After 5 years of continuous residence and documented improvements, the land became legally hers. 160 acres of Dakota prairie, a sod house with a Kang heated interior, and the small rise where Chen Wei lay buried under a cairn of stones. In 1891, she remarried. Friedrich Huber's wife had died of influenza the winter before. He was alone on his claim, 3 miles west, with fields he couldn't work by himself and a house that felt empty. He proposed in March when the snow was melting. Margarethe accepted. It was a practical arrangement, like most frontier marriages, but there was genuine affection too. Huber had helped her when no one else would. He understood what she'd built and why it mattered. He was kind to her children. Together they combined their claims. 320 acres, a new frame house with a proper Kang built into the design, and a future that seemed possible now in ways it hadn't before. She raised 5 children, her 3 and Huber's 2 from his first marriage. All of them survived to adulthood. Henry became a builder and constructed Kang-style beds throughout the region. Anna married a teacher and moved to Sioux Falls. Willie, the boy who'd nearly died in the blizzard of '87, became a doctor and delivered babies in the same county where his mother had saved his life. Margarethe Vogel Huber died in 1918 during the influenza epidemic. She was 61 years old. They buried her on the land she'd saved, beside Johann's grave and Chen Wei's cairn. The Kang design spread through German-Russian immigrant communities in the 1890s, then faded as the frontier changed. Coal replaced wood. Central heating replaced stoves. Frame houses replaced sod houses. The old ways were forgotten because they were no longer needed. By 1920, few Kangs were being built. By 1940, the technique had almost disappeared from American memory. What Margarethe didn't know, couldn't have known, was that the principle she'd learned from a dying Chinese worker was at least 2,000 years old. The Kang had heated homes across northern China since the Han Dynasty. Similar systems, the Korean ondol, the Roman hippocaust, had warmed people throughout history in every cold climate where humans had learned to capture heat in stone. She also didn't know that 50 years after the Great Die-Up, an architect named Frank Lloyd Wright would rediscover the principle. He'd seen heated floors in Japan and brought the concept back to America, building radiant heating systems into his prairie houses in 1936 and 37. Modern radiant floor heating, now considered cutting-edge sustainable design, uses the same physics Margarethe had built into her sod house in 1886. The technology existed, the need existed, the materials existed. But cultural barriers, suspicion, and simple ignorance had prevented the connection, until one dying man, one desperate woman, and one winter that killed everyone who did things the usual way. The Vogel claim today is a working farm. The sod house is long gone, collapsed back into the earth it came from, the way all sod houses eventually do. A modern farmhouse stands nearby, white-painted and comfortable, with central heating and insulated walls. The land is still farmed by descendants of the original homesteaders, not Vogels, the family line scattered across the continent generations ago, but families who stayed, who survived, who remember in some vague way that their great-great-grandparents made it through the worst winter in frontier memory because a neighbor taught them something no one else knew. Chen Wei's cairn is still there, a pile of stones on a slight rise, overlooking the prairie he never meant to cross and the land he never meant to save. No marker, no inscription. No one living knows who's buried there. But the stones haven't been moved in 140 years. Generation after generation has left them alone, sensing somehow that they matter, that someone important rests beneath them. He gave everything he had to a stranger who found him dying by the road. She built what he described. Her children survived. Their children survived. Some gifts echo longer than the lives of those who give them. On the worst night of the worst winter in frontier memory, a widow and her 3 children slept on a bed made of hollow bricks. No fire burned. The stove had been dead for hours. Outside, the temperature had fallen to 46 degrees below zero, cold enough to freeze flesh in minutes, cold enough to kill anyone caught without shelter. But inside that sod house, heat radiated upward through clay that had captured the warmth of yesterday's cooking fire. The children's faces were flushed. Their breath came easy. They didn't know how close they were to death because they were never close at all. 3 miles away, a family burned their furniture to survive. 5 miles away, a man froze standing up, 6 feet from his door. All across the Dakota prairie, the winter took its toll. Cattle and horses and homesteaders and dreams, all frozen solid, all lost. But not everyone. The woman who built the strange bed survived. The children who slept on the heated bricks grew up and had children of their own. The neighbor who came begging for help got it and lived and built her own bed the next summer. The skeptics fell silent or converted. The design spread from claim to claim. And for a brief moment in frontier history, a technology from the other side of the world kept Americans alive through cold that had no mercy. Winter doesn't care about experience. It doesn't care about conventional wisdom. It doesn't care about what's always been done. Winter only asks one question: will your preparation meet the challenge? Margarethe Vogel's answer was a bed of hollow bricks, a dying man's gift, a gamble that worked. It was desperate. It was unconventional. It was enough.